Is Dr. Ahmad Al-Khatib. I'm a Palestinian research fellow at Harvard Medical School. We have four fantastic speakers lined up for you today who will provide an important and diverse perspective on this topic. Khalid.
Thank you, Ahmed. I'll also give a quick introduction. My name is Khalid Kataili. I'm a second year's master's student at the Harvard Kennedy School. And my approach to this topic has been helping to organize the Palestine Trek, which takes 100 Harvard graduate students each year to Palestine for 8 days to show them the country firsthand. So if any of you would like to discuss afterwards, please come and find us. And now on to our panelists and our moderator. We have Professor Richard Parker, who will be moderating today, and I'm thrilled that he's here. He's a lecturer in public policy and senior fellow of the Shorenstein Center. He's not only an Oxford-trained economist, he founded the magazine Mother Jones, helped raise over $250 million for some 60 nonprofits, does political advising for senators in his free time, and teaches two of my favorite classes at the Harvard Kennedy School. We also have Diana Boutou, who is best known for her work as an advisor to the PLO. She served as a legal advisor to the Palestinian negotiating team in its negotiations with Israel, and later as an advisor to Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas. She's since been associated with Stanford, with Harvard, and the Institute for Middle East Understanding. Next to her we have Ihab al-Shahabi, who currently serves as the advisor to the Director General of Al Jazeera Media Network. He was also the former CEO of Al Jazeera America. He spent 7 years there after 12 years as a senior management consultant. Next we have Jake Chase Lubitz, who is the president of Palestine Advocacy Project, which was formerly known as Ads Against Apartheid, which creates powerful public media campaigns that educate Americans about the Palestinian struggle for freedom and advocate for an end to Israeli human rights abuses. And finally, last but not least, we have Nadia Bilbasi, who is the bureau chief for Al Arabiya news channel in Washington, D.C. She's been working as a foreign journalist for over 20 years and has interviewed world leaders. You should see this list. It's President Obama, President Bush, President Arafat, President Abbas, Prime Minister Tony Blair, Secretary John Kerry, and I've actually cut out a whole bunch of names after these. So it is my absolute pleasure with Ahmed here to introduce all of these panelists.
Thank you very much. I want to add that he was one of my finest students at the Kennedy School, so I appreciate the introduction, but you've earned my respect as well. We want to start this discussion in the following way. We have 60 minutes, and we're going to structure it with 20 minutes of comment here on the panel. We'll stop, take 10 minutes of questions related to those 20 minutes, restart for another 20 minutes, and then break again for 10 minutes of discussion. Our feeling was that there will be issues that arise in the early parts of the discussion here on the podium that people will want to join, and with asking you to wait until the very end seemed unnecessary. So what I'd like to do is start by talking about U.S. media coverage of the Palestinian cause and ask each of you, starting with Diana, to comment on what a realistic expectation is for the Palestinian cause within the U.S. media. And if you could talk about different forms of the U.S. media, just because forms have proliferated. There is a mainstream media, but there are many other things.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the question. Look, I think when approaching the question of media and, I'm sorry, my apologies. When approaching the question of media and what a realistic expectation, as you put it, would be to actually document what life is like for Palestinians. We so much see in U.S. mainstream media that the reverse is true. You hear about the colonizer, the occupier, the oppressor, and all of the troubles that the colonizer, occupier, oppressor faces in its colonialism, occupation, and oppression of Palestinians. But we don't actually hear a lot about what is happening to Palestinians. In other words, the emphasis is always about what Israel is confronting and how Israel is confronting and what Israel is facing and what Israelis are facing. But you don't see in the mainstream media an explanation of what it's like to be a Palestinian and have to live under this military rule. I'll give you an example. A lot of times when working with U.S. journalists, I'll tell them, look, there's a new settlement that's been announced, you should cover that. A new piece of land has been confiscated. You might want to look into that. The Israelis have killed a Palestinian child, teenager, etc., a Palestinian child has been arrested, you should cover that. And for the mainstream media, this is just the same old story. And they're looking for something new and something different. And so the way that they end up covering it is always from the perspective of the oppressor rather than from the perspective of the oppressed. Is it too much to ask for the oppressed voice to be heard? I think not. I think the problem is that we've so oriented what our expectations are of U.S. media that it's now become mainstream to just think about Israel in these kind of two sides, or even words like conflict. This isn't a conflict. This is an occupation. This isn't a conflict. This is an oppression. Even that type of language is something that really speaks volumes to the way that Americans are viewing what's happening in Palestine. I think just to go beyond the how to get the message out there, that's one of the beauties now that we have in terms of not just having to focus on the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or the Boston Globe, et cetera, that because of this age, there's so much more information that can get out. The question is, how do you get that information out, given that we're so self-selecting now with the news media that we're approaching?
Thank you very much. Ahab, would you pick up on that line of questioning, particularly the variety of media outlets now available
What's
both
going
in the
on
United
in
States?
Palestine? I would like to dismiss that argument. So that's number one. And people might disagree, and it is a provoke thinking, but I would like to say the new millennium now, distinguish between the demographic, the new millennial. I mean, I am on the age, I consider myself on the age of the new millennium. You know, I'm like a new millennial. So the new millennial, they are very much worldly, they are very much international oriented. I've been around through the launch of Al Jazeera America, campaigning around the school, and really they have a lot of awareness, a lot of people, they have the awareness. Whether that's an interest or not an interest, that's a different story. So we need to distinguish, is the coverage in the mainstream? Yes. Is there awareness? Yes. Is there an interest? I don't think so. Now, we can discuss a lot, and a lot of people know about, you know, the monopoly before on the media. The certain dictionary the editorial are using, you know what I mean, in certain TV channel. This is, for example, in my opinion, you need to promote more the international news, because you need a voice, not about just asking the news channel to change the context, am I right? I think you need another voice. This is why you need the voice east to the west. And also you need the voice of west to the east. You need to interconnect these voices and build a context. Now, the other element that I would like to challenge, we have, and a lot of people, they see in TV, they see in the social media, I mean, depressing pictures. I mean, there is no question about it, that whether it is violence, it is, call it whatever you want to call it, am I right? Against the humanitarian, it is a violence. Now, it is in the mainstream now. What do we do? Okay, what our reaction for a new millennium? Building a campaign? Do you think by putting the Palestinian issue on the mainstream, it will impact the foreign policy? I don't think so. So I'd like to think a little bit differently. I'd like to think, you know, to take it from the different side, and I will share a story. I was reading a lot, and I understand, I read the book about Sword and Pen, am I right, where it says, you know, she monitors all the media, and we know the conclusion, am I right? She concluded very well, and a lot of people can read that book. But I need also to add the values for our new millennial. I need to add the values for what I believe it will be a reflections. We can talk a lot about the violence, but also on the other hand, there is a lot of a good story. I mean, I was reading, for example, an articles, how an architect, a woman architect, she is from Palestine. She decided, and she lives in Italy, she decided to go in Palestine and start building the image about how she can reconstruct, how she can preserve the heritage of the Palestinian. And also she created a job for the Palestinian. Now, this is kind of coverage, it will also balance what's going on the violence, am I right? We need this kind of stories. We need the American audience to be motivated and understand there is also a story about Palestinian collaborating with Jew cooperating with Palestinian. I think the concept of peace, the concept of building and raising this kind of image in the social media will play a huge effect. I was in the Bailey Center, you know what I mean, talking about how the movie impacting, you know what I mean, the psychology of the new millennium about terrorists and Muslim and this and this and this. Let's be smart. Let's bring these images, beautiful images in Palestine. There is a huge, beautiful images. We are not covering these images. Let's play the reverse psychology. Everybody aware of the violence. Everybody is campaigning for this violence. Now, we can go political dimensions, we can go media dimensions, but the way I would say it, and in my opinion, the angle that we need to promote, take the heroic, represent the Palestinian, the innovation, entrepreneurial, the peacemaking, and build it around the image in the American mainstream. That's my recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ahib. Jake, you grew up here in the United States, but you've also lived in Palestine. And so you have a deep familiarity with American media in all its forms. Talk about the ways in which American media frames overseas stories through either the personal interest or the human interest angle, which Diana mentioned, but also the hero or significant persona narrative, so that struggles or nations become reflections of individuals. And is there a figure, or are there figures who could play that role for the Palestinians in American media?
That's an interesting question, because I hadn't thought about it at all that way. I think at Palestine Advocacy Project, we really try to keep ourselves grounded in what we think is happening a little bit more than what obviously with an eye towards what we'd like to see happen. And I think the media is very much a reflection of the society that it serves. And in particularly in the United States, television media is fast. It has an attention deficit problem. And in that kind of environment, you're only going to get coverage of things that are explosive. And that's one of the reasons. I mean, there's a lot of natural biases that are not inherently pro-Israeli, but that become so because of the way the conflict is structured. So, for example, the primary offense, as far as Israelis see it against, by Palestinians against Israelis, is explosive. It's a terrorist attack. It's something that's shocking and something we perceive as barbaric. Ultimately, the primary offense by Israelis against Palestinians is slow and methodical, and very difficult for us to relate to. And so I think a big part of the reason that settlements aren't covered is because as Westerners, we have a hard time relating to what that means and why that's such a big problem. And so part of it, I mean, I really agree with Deanna that it's really important for, especially, I think radio has a lot of potential for this, and good print media has a lot of potential to try to tell longer stories and explore things. And I think in those sort of expositions, that's when you start to get a much better coverage. But television is primary, and television I don't think will ever really do that, except for maybe PBS. And so I think that's why we really try to focus on finding these points of identification, like Ahab said, between Americans and Palestinians. And that doesn't have to mean making Palestinians look like us. I think what it means is finding things that are genuinely Palestinian that people can relate to. I mean, poetry is a huge part of Palestinian culture. People like poetry, and I think that is a point of entry for people. And so finding those, I mean, honestly, tourism advertising could be very, very helpful. Nobody expects a tourism advertisement to tell everything about the country or about the culture. They expect that it will be the part of that culture that I am interested in as a Westerner.
Jake, let me follow up on that.
Yeah.
Given for your generation the importance of social media, the fact that very few of you actually turn...
And my generation also.
All you young people at the table, right, exactly. That fewer and fewer young people are turning to mainstream media for their news, and more they're relying on non-mainstream forums, including comedians like Jon Stewart or Stephen Colbert in the recent past. Are there places there where contact could be increased, establishing denser Palestinian networks on Twitter or on Facebook that would reach more Americans and sort of bypass the struggle with mainstream media?
I think the interesting thing about social media is that everyone's sort of trying to use it and doesn't recognize that it is impossible to use. It is just organic. And that's good in one sense, because I think it's had a lot of impact on why the narrative in the United States has started to shift a little bit, because Palestinians naturally build those networks. And I mean, a big part of this, I think, is that there's a lot of sort of second-generation Palestinians now that are about my age, and so, you know, their parents are immigrants. The goal of their parents was to settle themselves here and become established. Their kids are more confident as Americans and feel fully entitled to present their stories. That combined with social media, I think, is a big part of the shift that we see. But the flip side of that is that, you know, if I look at the Facebook page of a friend of mine who comes from a different environment and is conservative, the world will look entirely different. Because the way the algorithms work, Facebook shows you things that you are likely to click on. And so we are surrounded by things we already agree with. And that's one reason, again, at Palestine Advocacy Project, that we're really hesitant to use social media aggressively for anything other than fundraising. Because we know we're only going to get to the same people who already agree with us.
Great. Nadia, would you join this conversation? You said, I believe in passing, that you were on the Diane Rehm show yesterday, and it's a flagship NPR interview program. Are there specific sort of shoulder media? The NPR is partly mainstream and partly not mainstream. Is that a format that can be useful in this?
Well, thank you, and thank you all for inviting us. And just bear with me, I have a little bit of a cold and a bit exhausted from covering Washington, as you can imagine. Let me just start by disagreeing with Ihab, which is a good thing to start an argument on a panel. I don't think the problem for the Palestinians is image. I don't think we have just good stories of a Palestinian musician or a scientist or a famous lawyer, whatever. If we only manage to get these stories on mainstream American media, then the American audience will say, well, the Palestinians are really entitled to have their independent state. They deserve to have a state. I think this is not the case. The case that many of us will agree on, which is assumption that you can qualify it, which is basically that there is an inherent bias in mainstream American media towards the Palestinian question. If you look in general, you will see an American public opinion who are in favor of Israel. There's no doubt about this. There is administrations, regardless if they're Republicans or Democrats, they will always protect Israel in international forum, even when they violate international law and human rights. They will protect them, and they will use the veto rights at the UN Security Council. You have Congress who is staunchly pro-Israel, even to the degree that many Israelis argue that the Congress is pro-Likud and a right-wing Israeli government, that a prime minister himself, just before getting re-elected, denies that the Palestinians should have a right to a statehood. So against this narrative, it's really hard to make a case for the Palestinians in the mainstream American media, because the media is the agenda setter. And if you look at the statistics, and I work in the media and I follow them, you will see, for example, is when you talk about conflicts, every time there is a military conflict between Israel and the Palestinians, say in the last few wars in Gaza, or the recent stabbing in Jerusalem, Palestinians will lose. If you look at the people who are on the mainstream, and I keep saying mainstream American media, and we need to identify that because there is a broadcast media, of course. You have Fox News on one side, we know where they stand. The chances that you have a fair coverage of Palestinian issues, I mean, I leave it to you to judge that. But even on CNN and MSNBC and all the other that we call mainstream broadcast media, if you look, every time there's a conflict, there is 4 Israeli officials appearing on American mainstream media to 1 Palestinian. And even when you have somebody like Prime Minister Netanyahu appearing on all the Sunday talk shows, speaking eloquently in American English, the anchors will give him the leeway. They don't challenge him, they don't ask hard questions, they don't. Even, and I give you one example, on a last appearance he did during the Gaza war with CBS, he was asked by Bob Schieffer, and then, of course, he went on to put his case along, and in the end he said, understandable, understandable. I mean, the anchor is agreeing with the Prime Minister and what he has to say, and even went to quote, to the degree to want to quote the former Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir, who said, we shouldn't really forgive the Arabs because they allow us to kill their children. This narrative is deeply inherited in the most of the American networks. Now, if you talk about the print media, of course they have better coverage, but I'll give you another example. 3 of the New York Times reporters, including current bureau chief or maybe the former one, has sons, serves at the Israeli Defense Forces, at the Israeli army. Okay? Just imagine if it was the other way around, where the coverage will go. I give you other few examples, just picking them up from the coverage that you don't see on the American media. One of them was a recent one of an Israeli settler, for example, who was taking a selfie with a dead Palestinian who's just been shot dead by an Israeli soldier. I mean, just imagine if this image was not covered by mainstream American media, but imagine the reverse. If it was a Palestinian who was taking this image, and imagine the adjectives that will be used in the American media. It was an Israeli soldier recently in the camp in Bethlehem who were threatening Palestinians of gassing them, bringing the worst memory of the worst history that we have witnessed of the Holocaust. This Israeli army officer has been suspended and pending investigation. But again, imagine if it was the reverse. This was not covered. There was another incident of settlers in the West Bank in the village of Dura who killed an 18-year-old baby. They threw a bomb, or it was a fire bomb. He died, and his parents later died. And New York Times...
18-month-old baby, right?
18-month-year-old baby. His mother, and the New York Times described the attack as an arson. If it was the other way around, I'm sure the word terrorist will be used. So the American media is very selective of the way they cover the Palestinian question. For the reasons that I mentioned, is the whole public, and you won't be able to change that unless you have an informed public. The best way to serve a democracy is to have an informed public, is when they see images like this, they will recognize if the coverage is biased or not. So against this background, it's really hard to find somebody who will give the Palestinians a voice. In addition to that, you will have analysts, not just the spokespeople that the American networks always go for because they speak English fluently, or because they appeal to American public, or because they know how. And by the way, look at them, and I urge you to go and Google all this information, and you will find out that most of them are either the Israeli ambassador to Washington, or the Israeli representative to the UN, or the Israeli spokesman for the IDF, or the Israeli I don't know what, and the Israeli cabinet ministers who consider on the right even of Prime Minister Netanyahu, like Naftali Bennett, whatever. They give them platform all the time. The Palestinian voices are absent. So how can you make the American public really informed of what's happening in Palestine? How can you start when you have this kind of obvious bias, at least to me? Now, on top of that, I think in the media in general, and has been criticized, it's been lazy and it has been lethargic in looking at the facts and checking things. So the Palestinian issues in the last, whatever decades even, not just recently, because we will talk about recently and 9/11 and the rise of ISIS, etc., and the Arab Spring. But it's never been said as there is occupation, as Diana said, the word occupation is never mentioned, as if it's two equal sides, and this every now and then they start to kill each other, or there is violence erupts because they're going to disturb the life of an average Israeli citizen who wants to have a really normal life and go to beaches in the weekend, and these Palestinians go on a stabbing spree or whatever. It's never been the case that it is the occupation stupid. That's the word that it should be over and over emphasized. It is the people who are struggling to have their independent state since 1967, and they denying this right. And it is Israel practicing certain practices has been violating international law, and nobody is criticizing them for that. And even if it was mentioned in American media, I'm just wrapping up, sorry. It was mentioned, it will be just adding a lip service to say, oh yes, there is Palestinian civilians has been killed. And just to leave you with statistics, in the last war in Gaza, there was 520 children were killed, there were 320 women were killed, there was 200 plus medical staff were killed, there is 16 journalists were killed. Have you seen the statistics on the American media?
Thank you. Thank you, all four of you, for a strong opening. I want to keep our promise to involve you as an audience in this conversation. And so we have staff with microphones, and we are going to use about 10 minutes, so I think reasonably 3 questions. Let me just also say the questions need to be questions, not statements. I'll be looking for question marks, and they need to be brief, more than a paragraph, and you'll hear my voice again. So question marks and brief. Yes, you, sir. Yes.
First of all, thank you all for being here and providing us with this rich experience. Oftentimes, when the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is mentioned, for example, when it's an Israeli, there's an Israeli death, the word that's used to describe it is killed, and when it happens to Palestinians, the word is died. But there have been signs of turning points. Last week, I think, the MSNBC showed a map of loss of Palestinian land. So I want to ask, do you think, should we expect a huge turning point right now? And what should we expect as a response from the Israeli PR machine?
Do you want to direct it to one of our panelists? Or open? All right. Would you take a shot at that, please? Thank you.
That's a great question, and thank you. Look, I think that we have to be really careful about terminology. This is not a conflict. A conflict implies 2 equal parties that are just coming in and having a little bit of a dispute, and whatever happens. This is an occupation. This is a colonization. This is not. So please don't use the term conflict. The other thing that is what was interesting with what you said is that you use the passive voice, and you're absolutely correct. People will often use the passive voice. 520 Palestinians were killed. Or so-and-so women died. And what you find that's very interesting is that we have to start moving away from the passive voice into the active voice. Bombs just don't drop on people. Right? Bombs are dropped by people. It's not a question of somebody just dying or clashes, my other favorite silly word. Right? There's an active machinery that is going out and killing people, and so we have to be very careful about using the active voice. Now, to get to the question of what happened with MSNBC, yes, the map went up, the map comes down, an apology is issued, etc. For those who don't know, there was a map of the land loss of Palestine from over the years. A week late, or a few days later, there was an apology that was issued by MSNBC for airing the map. That being said, I think that we are now at a point where the tide is turning. If you look at the numbers, and yes, Nadia's right, there is a significant percentage of the American population that remains pro-Israel. That's without a doubt. But I encourage you to dissect the segments of that population that composes that number. And what you're going to find is that the people who are the most ardent pro-Israel are in a certain age group. And fortunately, it's an age group that is moving aside. Right?
They're gonna die soon.
Exception here. Right? And that the younger age groups, like between the ages of 18 to 24, are actually very, very staunchly pro-Palestinian. And if you break it up even further and look into the demographics of where they're from, the Latino community, Black community, etc., again, you're going to see that the numbers are different. And even within the Jewish community.
Yeah.
Exactly. So all of these numbers are showing that there's a change. And I'm going to use an example. It's not a perfect example. Please don't anybody fault me on it. But it's just an example. If you look at the numbers of people who supported marriage equality, if you look at that number in the 70s, all right, there were vast numbers of people who were obviously against. And then if you keep tracking public opinion, at a certain point over the years, the lines cross. The lines cross, and then we see a change in policy. We are now at the cusp of the lines crossing on Palestine. We are very close, and so I do think that we're going to see a policy change very soon.
If you allow me to.
Let me just, hold on just a sec. We have a little trade-off here. What I'd like to do is actually ask one or two of you to comment per question. So if do you want to be the second? We need to keep it short because I want to get more questioners in.
No, I mean, just very quickly, I agree. But I mean, sure, I agree about this. And the key emphasis here about the new demographic, that's critical. But if you see the US is lagging, if you see Europe, most of the parliament, the foreign parliament, they have agreed, and you can see it's American is following. So there is no question about what you said. Thank you.
Thank you. Right over here. I'm having a little difficulty seeing out there, but I'll do my best, okay?
Hi, my name is Ralph. I'm a member of Solidarity for Palestinian Human Rights at McGill. Jake, you said something very interesting about not being able to reach out to people who aren't already knowledgeable or sympathetic to the Palestinian cause. We find this is a problem in our own group while reaching out to people who aren't. So it's always to people who come to events, who come to get educated. So my question for you, and I guess this is a general question for the panel, what would be your advice or how to overcome the difficulties of reaching out to people who might not have the privilege of access to information or education, or might not be sympathetic or on the fence about the issue?
I like that question. I think, some of the notes that I was making before this had to do with what I sometimes feel is a lack of empathy by people who are trying to communicate this message with the people they're trying to communicate it to. And, I think a big part of that is, I speak from personal experience here because I think anyone who's not Palestinian at some point made a choice that this was something they were going to be interested in, and then they learned about it and then hopefully became politically active. And so, why is that choice made? And so I think we do have to get better at looking for points that, I remember when taking different friends to the West Bank, a completely different thing would bother one person as compared to another person. And usually it had to do with their background. Like business people saw the settlements in the West Bank and said, this is just such a huge waste of money. Like, why would they be doing this if they didn't want all the land? People who were interested in education were really put off by the fact that the Israelis shut down the universities during the Intifada. So figuring out what it is that people care about is a big part of it. But also recognizing that, we all make shortcuts in our analysis of pretty much everything except for those few things that really interest us. It kind of gets back to that question of choice. And so recognizing that kind of presenting somebody with a political perspective on something before you give them something else to identify with. Most of us, I can tell you, most of us that eventually decided to be interested in Palestine, it's because we met a Palestinian and that was an interesting person. And that's how it developed. So trying to create those personal relationships, I think, is important. And then finally, I think recognizing that it is really easy for somebody who's American to feel like an Israeli thinks like them. And why that's important is because, if I put out a message that says, the Israelis committed this terrible crime during a war, an American thinks, well, an Israeli thinks like me, and I would never do that without a reason. So I'm sure there's more of a story to this. I don't trust it. And that's a pretty natural reaction. Like, I don't think there's an ignorance to it, but there's an ignorance to everything. And so I think recognizing that sometimes just presenting information is not effective, and getting people to ask questions might be more effective. So one ad campaign we're thinking about doing, for example, well, there's one we're definitely doing, which is Mahmoud Darwish poetry all over Boston in subways and buses early next year. And we're building an animated 10-minute, which is a little too long, but 10-minute animated video that's just sort of trying to be non-polemical history of the conflict, not the conflict, I'm sorry, the occupation and the development of it. And so I think, and the idea is somebody sees the poetry and thinks, this is interesting, that's only an excerpt, I want to read the rest. They read the rest, we put up an interpretation that presents the context, and in that context, the word occupation would have to be mentioned. And they click a link and they see the video, and the idea is, I was just interested in this poem, now I want to know what it's about, I've made the choice to go learn about this, and that's when people, I think, tend to be much more open-minded. So finding ways of getting people to make a choice like that is key.
Thank you, Jake. Because I'm trying to keep us on schedule, I'm going to actually ask if Nadja can not comment here, but lead off the panel as we turn back to the panel now for another 20 minutes. So let me pose a new question, and then we'll come back to you with questions. And I apologize, I'm not going to take any more questions on this round right now. We need to move on to the next question. So the question is this. The perception of Israel and Palestine among Americans has been reshaped first by 9/11's impact, then by the U.S. invasion of Iraq, then by the Arab Spring and the consequences of it, and now the issue is Syria. How is it that Palestinians can hope in that clutter, if you will, of news coming from the region with so many complex variables to make headway in getting a message across?
Well, it's an uphill battle. There is no doubt about it, that it's so many geopolitical events that took place that has pushed the Palestinian-Israel conflict to the back, and it used to the Israelis' interest in so many ways, just to say that we cannot really have negotiation with the Palestinians, first because we don't have a partner, second we have a terrorist organization that's called Hamas that denies Israel the right to exist, and link it very cleverly with 9/11 and appealing to the American public and through Congress as well to say that you have terrorists like ISIS and Al-Qaeda, and we deal with our own terrorists, which is Hamas and Islamic Jihad and other Palestinian groups, etc. So unfortunately, I think what happened in 9/11 has shaped the American psyche in a way that lumped everybody, not just, it no longer is a nationalist Palestinian issue, it became a Muslim issue as well, to the degree that you see it now even with presidential candidates like Ben Carson, who said, I cannot even imagine having a Muslim president at the White House, So these things I think, negatively has affected the Palestinian question, and it make it less of priority in terms of even negotiation, just as I mentioned before last week, on Friday actually, the White House admitted for the first time that forget about the negotiation just before President Obama is going to meet with Netanyahu on Monday. It's like we're not going to even have a try at it. So even that little fig leaf that there is a process and there is negotiation that started 20 years ago and has not led to a Palestinian state is no longer valid. And on top of that, there's a calamity of the Syrian situation, which is the worst humanitarian crisis in the 21st century, with 12 million people on the move. They left their homes since the conflict started, whether refugees or displaced. Refugees flocking to Europe in their millions and hundreds of thousands, 200,000 dead in 4 years in Syria. So the focus has shifted, there is no doubt, because of what's happened as a result of the Arab Spring, in addition to the rise of ISIS on the back of the remnants of Al-Qaeda in Iraq and in Syria. So now, for the Americans, anything to do with a plane or, as we've seen recently with the Russian plane, is basically has pushed, unfortunately, the Palestinian question into almost non-existent in terms of international attempts trying to find a resolution.
Thank you. That's a very sobering assessment. Deanna, can you offer some of your own thoughts on this?
I think Nadia is exactly right, and just to add to this, I think a lot of this is precisely what Israel wants. I mean, Israel loves and thrives off of being able to deflect from what it's doing in order to, and focusing on something else. You can just look at the recent Iran negotiations. As the Iran negotiations were taking place, the Israelis were using the opportunity to build and expand more settlements. During the period of the attack on Iraq, same thing. They used the opportunity to build and expand more settlements, to put Gaza behind, place Gaza under siege and put it behind walls and bombard it, etc. And so this reality is something that Israel thrives off. It is always looking for some other attention grabber so that it can continue to carry out the policies that it is wanted to carry out. all of this being said, I also think that we as Palestinians have to look at ourselves. And this has been a leadership that hasn't really grasped that it needs to connect all of these different issues and put the Palestinian struggle at the forefront, because Palestine is what's leading to Iraq, Palestine is what's leading to Syria, Palestine is what's leading to Egypt, and so on and so forth. And instead, this has been a leadership that has turned into itself, that is looking only at the Palestinian issue and isn't really understanding the regional, the greater regional design.
Ahab, would you join this discussion?
Sure. I mean, again, my favorite guy is Jake.
Close to the mic.
Thank you.
You know, my favorite guy is Jake because he agreed with me on the concept. All right.
That may not be the best metric.
We can talk forever.
I'm also the only other guy on the
we can
panel.
talk forever about, you know what I mean, the oppression, the occupations, you know what I mean, the news worthy or not, and how the news prioritize. And when it comes to the Palestinian, it's a snapshot. Am I right? If the breaking news is about Syria, the whole context about Palestine is gone. You know what I mean? For a few weeks. And then if this is a breaking news about Yemen, the whole Palestinian concept is gone. And then if you try to draw a picture, you know what I mean, about the Palestinians and the stereotype and all of this, you will have a very negative image among American mainstream. Am I right? So what do you do? I mean, my question is, we can talk about it all, and it's been written on many books. And I said, I will repeat again about the sword and pen. You can write, you can read it, and you can conclude a lot of what's going on. But where I agree with Jake, and is it like the time has come to build like one movie in the theater, you know what I mean, that you sandwich the message in the right way, in an appealing way to the mainstream, can create a huge impact, you know what I mean, from 10,000, you know, TV station that you can do it. A lot of people might disagree and laugh. I strongly believe, I've been, you know, launching Al Jazeera America. I saw what CNN is covering. I follow the social media. But sometimes the emotional hook, when you go and talk about, you know, our, you know, poet and how you can link it is a movie. How many movies have we done as an Arab, you know what I mean, or American Arab, to go to the movie theater and do a documentary or do a movie that really promote the concept of the right, but also in a very appealing with emotional hook? Okay. How many of us done it? See the other side, how many have done it? Okay. See about the Iraqi war, how many movies has been, you know, gave an perceptions to the mainstream, if we are talking. The power of the documentaries, the power of the movies, it's amazing. And we shy for us, you know, whether we are Arab or Muslim or Palestinian, we shy from Hollywood. We shy about the documentary. The time has come for this. And this is what I am advocating. If I have money, I will advocate for this.
Okay. All right.
I will hire Jake.
Jake, let me have you. Thanks. Will you cast your friend Jake in the movie? Is that our new Matt Damon? Is that that's?
I also think people might be a little upset that a young white Jewish boy is playing a Palestinian in a movie.
It will be different. I have a different.
You can appeal to the Christians and you can play Jesus Christ. How about that? Let me ask you to build on this line of questioning by talking some about the impact of Netanyahu's speech to Congress and what it is that Palestinians can do or did do, tell us, to build off of the clear levels of resentment and anger toward Netanyahu. That seems to me it was a moment of great significance, and it hasn't been lost yet.
It's actually Netanyahu's the first thing on my list of notes. He's probably my favorite thing from a PR perspective, because like, you just don't, I mean, the problem is we don't know what to say. Like, he'll go on TV and I'll look at a friend and go, and that's it, because he says stuff that's just so outrageous. And I actually do think that's having an impact. And that ties into another thing, which I think is that people's attention spans are short regardless of what's happening. And so, you know, Syria's been happening for 4 years and it's tragic. It is not on the top of people's minds. And that's just because the same thing keeps happening. It's the same problem that we have with settlements. After the first one happens, nobody cares. And so because of that, I think Palestine may not be crowded out as much as we think it is, partly because we're only talking about foreign policy news, which is still a very small segment of news.
And audience.
and audience.
Right.
And it's an important audience, so I don't really think it's totally crowding it out. And fortunately, when it's not crowding out, Netanyahu is saying things that are completely outrageous. And so, you know, just putting up a quote that he says is a pretty powerful thing, I think, without any context, because it provides all the context. Just his title provides.
Israel's Donald Trump is what you're suggesting, or?
Yeah, but a little bit more politically savvy, and with an audience that I think his audience is an Israeli audience. It's not really an American one, and that's part of why it works.
Can I just say something?
Say one more thing, and
just very quickly. I just want to win Ihab's affection, so I want to agree with him on the Hollywood things for sure. And I will tell you something. For example, this success story of this Palestinian kid from Gaza, Hamad Asif, the singer who won Arab Idol, can make a huge difference in winning hearts and minds. And actually, his movie is going to play soon in America because it's already gathering attention in Europe, and that's a great narrative for the Palestinians, for sure.
Keeping with the time clock, I want to open this up again to questioning by the audience. So I'm going to look out here. Are there questions immediately? Yes, ma'am, right down here. And if you want to direct it to someone in particular, just say so.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Doha Al-Idris. I'm half Palestinian, half Saudi. So my question is to Mr. Ihab. You were pointing about like bringing the good image about Palestinian and like peacemaking. So we're seeing now in the social media like how young Palestinians are standing for themselves and they're fighting back. So are you saying that this would be a positive for the Palestinian occupation?
See, I'm saying there is...
Come forward to the mic.
Sorry. What I'm saying is there should be a balance between, you know, the narrative of the violence, and we know the suffering. Am I right? Everybody knows the suffering. If you go to the mainstream, and when I go back again, I will say what's going on about the Palestinian in the mainstream is very obvious. People think that, oh, the American is not aware. When Ayman Muhyiddin, the ex-correspondent of Al Jazeera, and then he was the correspondent of the NBC, and they tried to take him off from Gaza, see what the social media did. You know, that indicates an awareness. The social media pushed very hard until NBC came back, and they put him back again to cover Gaza. So that's the concept. The other type, what I'm trying to say is, as we are showing all this violence, you have to understand there is a new generation is coming. If we look for the Gaza, you know, who was born, you know, 6 years ago, there is nothing he has seen other than violence and violence and violence and no education whatsoever. Now, what is the psychology? I mean, let's be here and talking about, you know, we can keep the same narrative as 1967, and I'm not a lawyer, you know what I mean? I am trying just to see the narrative that has been said since 1967 when Yasser Arafat, Abbas, and this and this. I'm not against anybody, but we are repeating the same narrative. Am I right? The time has changed. I mean, come on, for God's sake. The new millennium need to change the narrative a little bit. We know about the Gaza people. This young generation for 6 years has been under extreme psychological impact. It is the time to bring them something and to tell them about their history, to tell them about peace, to tell them about this. Yes, we all as a community has a social responsibility. We are not denying our social responsibility, but we have at the end to be smart how also we do it in a two-way, in a way that we bring our image back, and also on a way that we bring the image for these young kids. There is a piece also to talk.
Thank you. Diane, you had a comment.
Yeah. Yeah, I wanted to say, look, I think the narrative has actually shifted. In the past, just even from before, I live in Palestine, and I'm just here for the week. But in the past, before I moved to Palestine, the emphasis was always about a state. It was always about negotiations. It was always about, getting in the same room with the Israelis. That's totally changed now. Now the emphasis is about freedom. It's about equality. It's about a push for rights. rights. It's no longer about a state or any of that stuff. And getting to the issue of positive versus negative images. Look, we're Palestinian. We're not God. And so we have warts. We have issues, and I think that we're doing a disservice to Palestinians and the Palestinian struggle if we're just saying that certain voices can be heard and others can't. I think that we have to start giving people the entire range of what Palestinian life looks like and who we are, not just on the political side, but on issues of culture and issues of economics and issues of language and literature and all these things, so that we ourselves are able to articulate that we're not just this narrow group of people. In other words, we're not just victims. We are people who have a broad range of ideas and perspectives, and I think this is what, for me, as a Palestinian living in Palestine, is what's so frustrating, is that it becomes so reductionist, focusing only on the issue of violence, and in that, when focusing on the issue of violence, we happen to be the perpetrators, not the victims of it, and the emphasis is always about what it's like for the occupier, and the pain that the occupier faces in taking away our freedom. That's the issue that I want to get at.
Thank you. I will take another question. I'm going to look out here. Young lady back here.
Hi. So I'm Palestinian, but I grew up in New York. And one of the things, you guys, a lot of you have focused on, and Diana, you specifically mentioned like conservative Israelis or conservative Jews who are older now, who are pro-Israeli. But one of the issues that I've had to deal with, I think, in my communications with people has been the liberal Jew or the liberal Israeli, because those are the people that kind of normalize the conflict or make it, we want peace, we want this to be okay. So my question is that what do you do about that? The person who wants to have a conversation with you about it, who wants to talk to you about it, who thinks that you're a human being, but they justify the occupation, or they justify the human rights violations that are happening in Israel.
Nadia, could you start us off on this one?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I believe in dialogue. It's really the only way to go forward. You have to convince people, the one who agree with you, half agree with you, and the one who vehemently disagree with you. So I'm willing to speak to an Israeli settler and to stand there, because the problem with occupation is always dehumanize you. You always see the other as the other. He's the enemy. And only if people can sit together and talk to each other and share stories. Now, it does not diminish the whole concept that the biggest human rights violator is an occupation. And it's really hard to convince. I grew up in Gaza. I lived Gaza a long time ago, and I can only imagine what is it like for this new generation. So it's hard for me to talk to them from my comfort in Washington and to tell them you have to believe in the concept of peace when they live in a huge jail, when they cannot leave. I mean, my cousins cannot see in Gaza, cannot see my cousins in Jerusalem. They need a military permit to be able to cross for 20 minutes ride. I mean, can you imagine this is happening in the 21st century? But this is a result of an occupation. So the concept is it takes your dignity away. It's not just the death and the violence and the confiscation of land, but actually it's the concept of dehumanizing the Palestinians and corrupting morally the Israelis. It also, imagine what it does to the Israelis and themselves when you have an 18-year-old on a checkpoint who thinks he's superior to you because he has a gun. And he would treat you like a fifth-class citizen. I can travel with the president on Air Force One, and I'm respected, but I turn my back and go back as a Palestinian, and I'm treated like fifth-class citizen. So that's the problem with the occupation. But I honestly believe, from day one, nothing to do with living in the West for 30 years, the way that I lived in Gaza under occupation, the only way to go is to talk to people. You have to convince them with ideas. And no matter how hard it is, and it sounds like a drop in the ocean that you're not going to make a difference, but try to convince them. And ultimately, if you win one heart and one mind at the time, you're making success.
Thank you, Nadia. Because of the time, I can't take another question now. What I'd like to do is ask the four panelists to each give a 1-minute summary of what they think the most important takeaway is from this panel and from this conference today. Would you lead us off?
I'm going to be brief. Look, I think the big takeaway from this is that we have a lot of work to do. And the fact that we are already facing a very sophisticated media machine. It's a sophisticated media machine that has been operating for decades with complete carte blanche, as one would say, without anybody challenging the narrative, without people even pushing back. I mean, I remember my father used to have what I called the news media face, which is he would watch the news and he would just sort of do this and then change the channel, right? So if and I picked up on it as a small child, right?
It wasn't even Fox.
And it wasn't even Fox back then, right? So if my father had transformed his news media face into letter writing campaigns, into pushing back on journalists, etc., I think we would have seen, instead of him watching the news media face and me picking up on that we would see a very different news media today than we saw back then. Things are changing. I don't want people to believe that it isn't changing. It is changing. The fact that we see more Palestinians now, the fact that there are some young producers who call Palestinians and say we need balance, even as problematic as that word is, things are changing. We just need to get a greater voice of people in this room and outside of this room to be pushing back on the media and pushing on terminology and pushing on all these issues and demand that Palestinians be heard.
Thank you very much. Ahab.
I mean, for me, I think I made my message clear, but I need to mention quickly that we're going to depend on the new millennium. You know what I mean? We have a trust on them. In America now, what you see, you have a very thin civic community. Very thin civic community who can build a dialogue about the issues, a smart dialogue about the issue. What we need to do now is, our responsibility is for the new millennium to start having a thick civic community who can build a dialogue and can empower.
Great.
And also, and this is my last remark, because the new millennium is important, and I strongly believe about how to build that dialogue. We haven't been educated on that dialogue. I'm not talking about political dialogue, but it's about, there is a lot of dialogue building. You can do it as a track to diplomacy for the new millennium. Also, my final point here is, also for the leadership of the Palestinian, the time has come to engage the young generations. I was with the Department of State. I said, how many times you saw, when the delegate comes, you saw a young, dynamic generations. When I go to the Congress and this and this and this, I see 25 years old. And the time has come to bring young generations who can do the work. It's enough. Enough is enough, in my opinion. I mean, I love what they are doing. I don't love what they are doing, to be honest with you. But the new millennial has to be empowered and to be a succession plan on this. Thank you.
Ahab, that was a terrific setup for your friend Jake, young generation speaking. Jake, take it away.
The treasurer of our organization would say that the answer is donate to Palestine Advocacy Project. But I think the really big takeaway is, well, I'm going to say this as a non-Palestinian, because I think asking Palestinians to sort of mold their message to make Americans comfortable is really not fair. But if you are not in that group, then I think, you know, you have the kind of the responsibility to answer the question that came from this side. You know, there's people who push back, especially. I mean, I at one point was that like liberal Jewish kid who, you know, thought he knew everything, and it really is. It's an intellectual arrogance problem more than it is like a logic problem. But honestly, just the patience. Like, it just takes time, and you just keep answering questions and push back hard when you need to, and sort of ask a question when you can. But it is a person-to-person thing. I really think that is the only mechanism of really taking somebody from one position to another position politically. So really just having patience and talking to a lot of people is a big part.
Jake, thank you. That's terrific. Nadia?
Sorry, I talked too much. I'm a reporter, so I'm trying to make it really short. One of my favorite persons really to quote is Martin Luther, who says there is something in the human soul that cries for freedom. And this is the Palestinian narrative. It's not economic peace. It's not people who are trying to have a better life. It's people who are trying to free themselves from occupation. The Palestinians need to get this message across. Saying that, and we talk so much about the occupation, also the Palestinians are the great fault, because whenever we have a Palestinian spokesperson, it always come across as angry. As you said, the branding is an one of major problems. They need to change that. The images that we see of funeral of angry young men shouting slogans, people in the West don't identify with that. The important thing is take one step at a time, dialogue, changing the public opinion in the United States. This is how you're going to change policies, whether it's in the White House or in Congress. And I agree, the young generation now, through the social media that enables them, will be able to give different people a different point of view that is always being dominated and monopolized by the mainstream media. So I think altogether we need to work, and especially with Jewish American. There's a great chunk of them who believe in the concept of two states, and I think one great thing about America, many are great things about America, but one of it is the sense of justice. If we can get this message across that people believe in justice and a fairer future for everyone, then I think we all winners.
Nadia, thank you. As the moderator of this panel, I want to thank, on behalf of all of us, this audience for thoughtful questions, and I apologize that we weren't able to take more from you. But I'd also like to thank our four panelists, Diana, Ahab, Jake, and Nadia, for what I think was just a terrific exchange of views and presentation this morning. So would you join me in thanking the four of them?
And thank you. Excellent moderation.
Ladies and gentlemen, we stand adjourned as a panel, and we turn it over to you.
Perfect, and I think we also need to give a big round of applause for Professor Parker. Thank you very much for moderating the panel. And just to everyone who's here tonight, it's incredible to see such a great turnout on such an important issue, so I want to thank each and every one of you as well for coming out today. So thank you very, very much.